So before we begin though, in order to facilitate today's discussion, there are 4 key areas that we'd like to explore with you. The first is the general framework that regulates the process for a triennial review of water quality standards. Next, we're going to discuss the amendments that the Bureau is considering for the triennial review. And then we're going to go through the general administrative process and the tentative timelines to meet critical milestones. And finally, and most importantly, we're interested in hearing from you, the public, on areas of the water quality standards that you might have questions on or areas that you'd like us to consider for amendment. So to begin, we're going to start off with the regulatory framework for water quality standards. So what is a triennial review? In short, it's a review of the state's water quality standards, and it's called triennial because it's supposed to occur at least once every 3 years. There are more details on what is reviewed and the process to conduct a triennial review, including holding a hearing, and I'll discuss that a little later in the presentation. But to start off, we wanted to provide some high-level basic regulatory background that sets the reasoning. So this slide highlights the 3 areas of the Clean Water Act and the regulations that pertain specifically to the triennial review. First is under Section 303C1 of the Federal Pollution Control Act, or as it's commonly referred to, the Clean Water Act. Then under the regulations for environmental protection, specifically 40 CFR 131.20, and then finally we find regulatory language requiring a triennial review under Section 20.6.4.10a of the state's administrative code, or as we abbreviate it, NMAC. So now that we have the underlying foundation as set up in the regulations, let's explore what the standards are and then how they get developed. So from the general citations presented in the previous slide, we can break this down further so that you can see some of the basic regulatory background that drives the water quality standard development process. Overarching is the Federal Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act requires a state to adopt water quality standards with the objective to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. The Clean Water Act is implemented through federal regulation. So as we see in the second box here, under 40 CFR, states are required to hold a hearing on their water quality standards no less than every 3 years for the purpose of reviewing the designated uses, the anti-degradation policy, temporary standards, as well as other implementation policies in the standards. So as you'll see, this requirement really ends up being the guiding language as we proceed through the triennial review. In order to meet the requirement forth in the federal act and regulations, the state established the Water Quality Act, and as part of the act, they designated the Water Quality Control Commission. The commission, or as we may refer to it, the WQCC, has been delegated duties and powers to include the adoption of water quality standards in accordance with the Clean Water Act. Those standards are codified under NMAC. And it should be mentioned here that New Mexico has the authority to and has developed water quality standards under NMAC, not only for the nation's waters, but for waters of the state, which are defined under Section 7 and include a broader spectrum of waters, including wetlands. So as we've illustrated here, the state's water quality standards serve to meet both state and federal acts to uphold the objectives of the Clean Water Act. Because these standards are codified under rule, any amendment to these standards must undergo a rulemaking process. And there are other state and federal regulations that guide this process, but one of the predominant requirements for rulemaking is conducting a public hearing. And as it pertains to the triennial review, the New Mexico Environment Department, being the technical support for the Water Quality Control Commission, is the lead entity to ensure a triennial review is conducted every 3 years. So what is a water quality standard anyways? And what's the process for determining if an amendment is needed? In order to better understand water quality standards, I'm going to take a minute to walk you through the elements of a water quality standard. So as depicted here on the slide, a water quality standard as defined by EPA includes 3 elements: the designated use for a water body, the criteria that are required to support that use, and an anti-degradation policy. So as we just explained, the state's water quality standards are codified under 20.6.4 NMAC. And as many of you may know, there are other portions under NMAC that are outside of those three elements. And although they're not technically part of the standards, they are regulations that describe the process to uphold the state's Water Quality Act and Federal Clean Water Act. And so they are included in the triennial review as well. So I'm going to be going through each of these elements to give you a little bit more background on what they are and how they're reviewed as part of the triennial review process. So the first element of a water quality standard is the anti-degradation policy. This policy is fairly straightforward, and it lays out protections for ensuring degradation of waters does not occur. In New Mexico, we have 3 tiers of protections, all of which prevent degradation of water quality in waters of the state. So the most restrictive of protections are those waters designated as an outstanding national resource water, or as we call them, ONRWs. Activities that may affect the water quality in these waters is not prohibited, but it must be demonstrated not to cause degradation before being permitted. The second tier of protection under the anti-degradation policy is for those waters that are exceeding the highest possible designated use. And then at a minimum, and applicable for all waters of the state, the anti-degradation policy protects for the existing uses. Existing uses being those uses actually attained anytime after November 28, 1975, even if they're not the designated use or if they're not currently supporting that use. So remember, the goal of the Clean Water Act is to maintain and protect the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. So the anti-degradation policy ensures actions are being taken towards that objective by continually improving water quality. Because the anti-degradation policy is an element of the water quality standards, it's codified under 20.6.4 NMAC. However, the implementation plan for the policy is actually approved and adopted by the Water Quality Control Commission and EPA Region 6 as part of the state's water quality management plan and continuing planning process. So amendments to the implementation plan are actually done independently of the triennial review. As a general practice, the anti-degradation policy, though, under 20.6.4 NMAC, is only reviewed during the triennial review and warranted and amended if warranted. So moving on to the second element in water quality standards, which are designated uses. Designated uses can be thought of as the goals for a water body. They're the highest use to which the water body should be able to support. As part of meeting the objective of the Water Quality Act, the state has established 2 subcategories of recreational uses and 7 subcategories of aquatic life uses. In addition, the state also has designated uses for wildlife habitat, livestock watering, domestic water supply, irrigation, and fish culture. So in New Mexico, all waters of the state have, at a minimum, a designated use to protect for wildlife habitat, a recreational use, and at least 1 subcategory of aquatic life uses. Now, amending designated uses is the predominant type of amendment that we see in the state's water quality standards. And generally, it's the most involved type of amendment as far as processes go. And here's why. When a water body is identified to need a designated use review, a comprehensive evaluation is initiated through the development of a work plan. The work plan's intent is to evaluate whether there's sufficient evidence available to support an analysis, including the necessary data that would be needed for that analysis. And it's conducted whether a water body is believed to be overprotected or underprotected. So it's important to keep in mind not all work plans lead to an analysis, and not all analyses lead to supporting an amendment in a designated use. But for those work plans that do demonstrate there is support to conduct an analysis, either a use attainability analysis or an existing use analysis is then completed. The use attainability analysis is conducted if there's evidence a water is overprotected. This analysis is a 3-step process, which requires demonstration that the existing use will be protected. Remember, as we discussed in the anti-degradation policy, establishment of the factor preventing attainment of the current designated use, and then a demonstration of what the highest attainable use is. Now, since according to 40 CFR 131.10I, a designated use is not permitted to be less stringent than an existing use, the existing use analysis is actually much simpler, and it's conducted if there is water quality data demonstrating a water body is underprotected. And in general, all that's really required is evidence establishing the existing use. Since designated uses are codified under 20.6.4 NMAC, amendments, whether more stringent or less stringent, undergo the rulemaking process. But amendments to designated uses, unlike what we saw with the anti-degradation policy, are not limited to being brought forth during a triennial review or by the department. Rather, these amendments routinely undergo the rulemaking process independently at any time by the department or outside entities as deemed appropriate by the commission. So now that we've determined an appropriate use for a water body that upholds the objectives of the Clean Water Act, we need to establish the water pollutants that, if exceeded, would prevent that particular use. So for each designated use, there are a series of criteria that have been established. And the state has two types of criteria. We have numeric criteria and narrative criteria. The numeric criteria are specific constituents to which, if a defined concentration were to be exceeded, the use wouldn't be supported. And for example, if the water body had an arsenic concentration over 340 micrograms per liter, aquatic life couldn't survive. So how do we determine these criteria? Well, numeric criteria must be derived through scientific toxicological studies. And EPA plays a significant part in doing the heavy lifting on deriving these limits, as in many cases, they are the entity that culminates all those studies and derives guidance for the numeric criteria. And that's done as part of Section 304A of the Clean Water Act. The federal regulations require states to adopt those criteria unless we can demonstrate through scientific evidence that another criteria is more appropriate. The second type of criteria are narrative criteria. These criteria apply to all waters of the state, and they do not have specified limits. And you may have heard in the past that these are referred to as free-froms, meaning if possible through enforcement actions, these constituents should not be discharged to a surface water. And these include suspended solids, fats, oils, greases, organoleptics, plant nutrients, radioactivity, pathogens, temperature, turbidity, and total dissolved gases. In addition to free-froms, there are also narrative criteria for biological integrity. So unlike what we saw with designated uses, adopting or amending criteria has a different process and generally requires a higher scientific rigor to demonstrate the toxicological effects as it pertains to a particular use. As such, we generally only amend the criteria during a triennial review. So how do water quality standards fit into the bigger picture of water quality protection? And how does the triennial review serve as a vital component of that process? As water quality standards are developed, the agency conducts water quality monitoring and then assesses the quality against the applicable water quality standards. At this point, there may be indicators that a water quality standard is not appropriate for a particular water body. An analysis is then conducted to determine if the water quality standard warrants an amendment. Once the waters are assessed, the department prepares a list of waters that are not meeting the established water quality standards. This is often referred to as the 303D list, based on the section of the Clean Water Act to which the listing is required by states to be created. When waters are listed as impaired, there can be information indicating that the water quality standard that has been established is not attainable based on one of 6 defined criteria under the federal regulations. On the other spectrum, if the listing demonstrates that the water has always attained to a higher stringency than the designated use, this would give indication that the designated use isn't stringent enough. It's at either of these points that we would launch an analysis of the standard and determine if an amendment is warranted. From the impaired waters list, the total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs for short, are established. These limits are then used in developing limits in National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits and in developing watershed-based plans to minimize non-point source contributions. And throughout all of these processes, the public is provided opportunity to participate and engage. As it pertains to the state's triennial review, the public's involvement helps ensure the state's water quality standards are appropriate, which enhances the functionality in protecting and restoring the state's waters as established in the objectives of the Clean Water Act. So now that I've outlined some of the regulatory drivers for the development and amendment of water quality standards, I want to transition into the amendments that are being proposed in the 2020 Triennial Review. So in order to determine what revisions were necessary, the department began to review the requirements under 40 CFR 131.20 and 20.6.4.10a NMAC. And as I mentioned earlier, the federal language requires states review designated uses, the anti-degradation policy, temporary standards, as well as other implementation policies in the standards. The department has worked with Bureau staff in noting areas within the standards that warranted closer evaluation since the last triennial review. These potential revisions range from typographical corrections to expanding explanations of certain processes used to uphold the water quality standards. NMED then conducted an evaluation of those needs and assigned a ranking system to assist with prioritization of the potential revisions. The ranking was based on regulatory drivers and direct impacts in the implementation of standards. So we have 4 tiers. Tier 1 are those amendments that the state is required to review, such as the numeric criteria and EPA's 304A guidance. Tier 2 are those amendments that, although not required to be reviewed under a triennial, would pose implications for implementing water quality standards if not amended. Tier 3 are those amendments that, similar to Tier 1, can only be amended during a triennial, but would not pose implications if not made at this time. And these are more formatting or preferential wording that, although they're beneficial, they don't change implementation. And then there's Tier 4, which are those amendments that have the liberty to be brought forth outside of a triennial review. And these include ONRW nominations and use attainability analyses. So the department ended up determining that the revisions being brought forth during this particular triennial would be limited to those actions that were classified as either Tier 1 or Tier 2. Those that are Tier 3 or Tier 4 are not being brought forth at this time, either because they can be brought forth outside of a triennial review or are not of consequence in implementing water quality standards. For each of those that were identified as being Tier 1 or Tier 2, an in-depth analysis of the information needed to support the amendment, along with the history of that section, was conducted to ensure there was enough evidence available to proceed. And this has led us to a working list of potential amendments for the 2020 Triennial Review that we're here to discuss with you today. So, as we just discussed, we came up with a working list of potential amendments, and there were 6 general areas that the department is proposing amendments for, and we'll be discussing each of these in a little bit more detail. First, the state is proposing adding new language to the objectives of the state's water quality standards. Second, and as may be expected in any triennial review, there's always a need to update definitions. Third area of focus is clarifying language throughout 20.6.4 NMAC. Fourth are amendments clarifying existing regulatory processes, predominantly under the review of standards in Section 10 and the use attainability analysis in Section 15. The department is also evaluating a few designated use amendments, which I'll discuss here in more detail in a few minutes. And finally, as some of you may know, EPA updated a considerable number of aquatic life and human health criteria under 304A of the Clean Water Act. And as a result, there have been several proposed amendments to the state's numeric criteria. So I'll be going through each of these areas in a bit more detail, but if you want to reference the proposed amendments as they've been put out, they are on our Surface Water Quality Bureau's webpage. So the first amendment of considerable note is a new objective to the state's water quality standards. In 2019, Governor Lujan Grisham signed Executive Order 2019-003 on addressing climate change and energy waste prevention. EO 2019-003 directs all state agencies to evaluate the impacts of climate change on their programs and operations and integrate climate change mitigation and adaptation practices. Now, although the objective of the Clean Water Act and the regulations, particularly protections against degradation, inherently carry the intent of resiliency to climate change, it's vital to clearly call out the global and existential threat to our state's waters. These photos are examples of how climate change impacts water quality and some of the work that needs to be done to protect it. So as part of this directive, and to ensure water quality protections address the challenges posed by climate change, a new subsection was incorporated into 20.6.4.6 NMAC. The intent is to acknowledge that one of the objectives of the state's water quality standards is to address the threats posed to water quality by climate change. As part of the Triennial review, there have been several updates to the definition section. Some of these are just amendments to the existing definitions to enhance clarity or provide consistency in the implementation of standards, while some are new definitions that are being proposed. And again, they're intended to add clarity in the implementation of standards. Now, two of the definitions are actually from another section in NMAC and are being migrated into the definition section from another section in order to be consistent and aid in referencing. There are a series of general amendments that are being proposed, none of which add or remove existing applicability, but rather aid in implementation. These amendments include anti-degradation policy and implementation plan under Section 8, the outstanding national resource water section under Section 9, and this is just updating the procedural reference to reflect the adoption of climate change as we just discussed in Section 6. The applicability of water quality standards under Section 11, and that's to move the definitions of harmonic mean flow and unclassified waters of the state into the definition section. The compliance with water quality standards under Section 12, where the department is proposing to amend language to clarify that compliance schedules are allowed in NPDES permits on a case-by-case basis. The general criteria under Section 13 is adding language to include contaminants of emerging concern and specifically identifying those toxic pollutants that are identified in the state's surface and groundwater regulations under 20.6.2 NMAC, amending language in several sections as listed here on this slide to clarify the applicability to perennial reaches of tributaries 2. There are some minor amendments to language in sections 311, 312, 405, and 408 that are being proposed for consistency purposes. And although there's several significant amendments being proposed under Section 900, which we'll discuss in a few minutes, there are a few minor amendments as well, and these include clarifying language for marginal warm water criteria to be consistent with the definition in Section 7, correcting select acute and chronic hardness-based metals values that were miscalculated in the reference tables, adding clarification that the designated use for irrigation also includes irrigation storage, clarifying the language used for abbreviations. And as can always be expected in a triennial, the department's proposing to amend references just to be consistent with the most current versions of these documents. So beyond the general amendments being proposed during this triennial review, there's a few sections of NMAC that the department is proposing more significant amendments to. The first section that I'd like to discuss are those amendments in the review of standards need for additional studies, and that's under 20.6.4.10 NMAC. So as shown here on the slide, and as you can find on the Surface Water Quality Bureau's webpage, these amendments highlighted in red are intended to add clarity in implementing a water quality standard amendment. We're proposing to do this by adding a new subsection, as shown here as subsection B, and amending subsection C. This language is intended to clarify the required process for amending a designated use where the existing use is more stringent. This language also adds consistency with the federal language found under 40 CFR 131.10I. So as we'll discuss in the next slide, language is also being proposed to tie in these requirements with the requirements for amending a designated use to be less stringent. So once we establish a review of standards includes amending designated uses based on existing uses, the other section of NMAC that warranted more clarity in language is the use attainability analysis section under 20.6.4.15 NMAC. And for sake of readability, I didn't include the proposed language here, but as I said, you can find it on the Surface Water Bureau's website. In summary though, clarification of language here focused on incorporating headings to provide clarity on the application of each subsection, adding language to clarify that the hydrology protocol is an acceptable methodology for identifying perennial waters, adding a subsection to describe the process for determining the highest attainable use to provide consistency with the federal regs, adding a subsection to provide clarity and consistency with the process for removing and replacing a designated use. And that includes more descriptions of the required elements for an expedited process using the department's hydrology protocol. And finally, amending language to provide consistency with the state's water quality management plan and continuing planning process, and adding clarity regarding the process for a use attainability analysis being conducted by an entity other than the department. So there are two amendments to designated uses that are based on existing uses. As we touched on a while ago, an existing use is a use that's been attained at some point after November 28, 1975. In order to amend a designated use based on an existing use, demonstration must be made that the water was able to attain that water quality necessary for the use, and the water is supporting that use. So the first existing use analysis is evaluating several tributaries that currently have a secondary contact recreational use. There's evidence demonstrating at least some of these waters have an existing use supporting primary contact. Some of you may remember a similar amendment was taken before the Commission during the last triennial review. However, the Commission determined there was not sufficient evidence to demonstrate the water quality supported the use. Since that time, the department has developed a comprehensive existing use analysis to provide the evidence needed to amend the designated recreational uses for some of these tributaries. The other designated use amendment being proposed comes out of a joint stipulation between the department, Los Alamos National Laboratory, and Amigos Bravos. And this was entered into as part of the last triennial review. The department is proposing to amend designated uses and add a new section under 20.6.4.140 NMAC for intermittent portions of waters within Los Alamos National Labs, as demonstrated through an existing use analysis. As part of this, the waters currently classified in Section 128 are being proposed to only include identified ephemeral waters or ephemeral portions of waters within lands managed by the U.S. Department of Energy within LAML. As a natural outcome of the work conducted under the joint stipulation, the department is also preparing an existing use analysis, which should provide supporting evidence needed to propose adding several named perennial waters to Section 126. And work on both of these is still in the process and have not been fully completed. So finally, the largest area that underwent amendments was the criteria applicable to existing designated or attainable uses under Section 900. There are several major amendments being considered in this section. The first is the incorporation of numeric primary contact criteria for microcystins and cylindral permoxin. These constituents are associated with harmful algal blooms, and the limits being proposed for the state's water quality standards are consistent with those criteria promulgated by EPA under Section 304A of the Federal Clean Water Act. Additionally, the department is clarifying language for aluminum criteria. This includes adding language clarifying the pH range to which the acute and chronic aquatic life hardness-based criteria apply, reestablishing the acute and chronic aquatic life criteria for dissolved aluminum that is outside of that acceptable pH range for the hardness-based criteria. And as a result of these, an amendment including the removal of language regarding EPA's disapproval of the hardness-based equations for aluminum. As some of you may know, EPA recently issued a new aluminum criteria to which the department reviewed as part of the triennial review. However, after review, the department has determined the current hardness-based criteria is not going to be replaced with EPA's multilinear regression-based criteria. In addition to the proposed amendments to aluminum, EPA undertook a major update to numerous water quality criteria in 2015. As a result, there are amendments proposed for over 94 numeric criteria, both those criteria associated with human health organism only and those associated with acute and chronic aquatic life. These pollutants are being updated to comply with 40 CFR 131.20, which requires a state to adopt criteria established under Section 304A of the Clean Water Act or derive alternative criteria that are demonstrated to be protective of the use. As part of the aquatic life use criteria updates, EPA also recently updated the acute and chronic aquatic life ammonia criteria. So amendments proposed in subsections K, L, and M of Section 900 reflect those updates as well. As part of the triennial review, as it pertains to criteria, the department also identified several criteria that were listed under Section 304A of the Clean Water Act, but not incorporated into the state's water quality standards. So the department is proposing to add these criteria for acute and chronic aquatic life pollutants in order to comply with 40 CFR 131.20. So now that we've given some background on the regulatory framework and the amendments under consideration, we'd like to talk briefly about the administrative process and the tentative timelines for that process. So this slide gives a breakdown of the three primary components in the rulemaking process. The first of these is outreach. The department is bound by federal and state regulations that prescribe what outreach should include. In part, the department conducts tribal outreach, stakeholder outreach, and general public outreach. These outreach activities occur at several key steps in the process to ensure there's adequate opportunity for meaningful engagement. For this triennial review, the state has reached out to both tribes and stakeholders and is now reaching out to you, the public, on the proposed amendments. In tandem with outreach, the department must also develop the amendments and prepare the supporting documentation for those amendments. Following the input we received from our tribal and stakeholder outreach efforts, the department's prepared a public comment draft for review. The comments received from the public will be considered in preparation for filing with the Water Quality Control Commission. And finally, and also conducted interspersed with the outreach and amendment development, we have the legal and administrative tasks that have to be conducted for any rulemaking before the commission. This list identifies some of those major milestones that must be attended to for amendments for states' water quality standards. So these three elements really make up the process that's undertaken for a triennial review. Now this table provides a more concise breakdown of the steps for the rulemaking process, starting with outreach, which is done in accordance with the state's approved water quality management plan and continuing planning process. So you can see here the department has already petitioned the Water Quality Control Commission for a hearing date, which has been set for July 13th through 16th, 2021. And as circled here on the second row, the proposed amendments have been sent out for public comment. So the next steps include providing hearing notice. This is anticipated to be published approximately 60 days prior to the deadline to submit the notice of intent to present technical testimony, in order to provide opportunity for tribes, stakeholders, and members of the public to participate should they choose to do so. Keep in mind that there is additional opportunity for the public to provide comment during the hearing itself, even if they did not submit a notice of intent to present technical testimony. So after the hearing, the Water Quality Control Commission will deliberate and will eventually render an order. This will be drafted as a final order, and it includes a statement of reasons for each of the amendments. The approved amendments are then codified in rule once they're published in the state register, and it's at this point that the amendments become effective for state purposes. Once the amendments are effective, NMAC then submits the adopted rule to EPA Region 6 for review. EPA has 60 days to approve the proposed standards and 90 days to disapprove. However, it's the general practice of the department to engage EPA Region 6 early and often so that delays in the review process at this stage are minimized. So once the EPA approves the rule, then it's effective for purposes of the Clean Water Act, and notification to all parties is made. So due to the numerous regulatory requirements for each of these steps, this process, although lengthy, provides numerous opportunities for public participation. So as we stand with the current triennial review process, we can see here in this slide the general timeline of the major steps that must be completed. The activities on the top row illustrate those tasks involving tribes, stakeholders, and the public, while the bottom row depicts internal work being conducted by NMAC. And for a quick reference, the arrows in green are what's already been completed to date. So as you've seen, the administrative process for our rulemaking is lengthy, and it has uncertainties beyond the department or even the commission's control. So in order to comply with the federal regulations regarding the frequency of triennial reviews, NMAC initiates the hearing process at least once every 3 years from the date of EPA's approval from the last triennial. Since the last triennial review was approved by EPA in August of 2017, we initiated the administrative process to meet the triennial review timeline. So as you can see, we've undertaken several key steps to get where we are today. Starting with the bottom row, NMAC began working on needs for amendments back in spring, early summer 2019. Once the needs were identified, the prioritization phase we discussed earlier took place between July and October of 2019. Then from about September 2019 to May 2020, NMAC gathered and prepared evidence that it would need for the proposed amendments that were identified. At the same time, and as shown on the top row, between May and December 2019, there had been ongoing dialogue with interested parties. Then in January 2020, tribal outreach efforts were initiated. And then once we had gotten some discussion points on the potential amendments, NMAC began stakeholder outreach this past July. In order to keep with the essence of the triennial review's 3-year cycle, the department drafted proposed changes and petitioned the WQCC for a hearing date in August of 2020. The commission heard the department's petition in October and granted the hearing for July 13th through 16th, 2021. So at this point, NMAC is working with members of the public and gathering comments on the proposed changes in order to begin preparation for the hearing. So as we discussed in the previous slide, if the hearing and deliberations were to proceed without incident, the department could, in theory, publish the amended rule and submit to EPA the spring of 2022 with a potential approval by EPA for the summer of that same year. So now that we've presented information on what water quality standards are, what the department is proposing to do, and the tentative timeline. I want to express my sincere appreciation for everybody's time tonight, and we hope that the information that we've provided on the process and what we're proposing to amend has been informative. At this point, though, the department's interested from hearing from you. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris, and he can begin our listening session. Chris?
Terrific. Thank you, Jennifer. Let's see, you're on sharing.
Yes.
Okay, let me know when my screen pops up, please.
It's popped up.
Okay, great. So welcome to our listening and Q&A session. Thanks everybody for sticking around. To keep this organized, we ask that you either raise your hand by hovering over your name in the participants window or typing your desire to ask a question or make a statement in the chat window. And we'll just go through sequentially. And once we have all those items addressed, we'll open the floor up. But when you do ask a question, make sure you state your name first. Let me bring up the participants window and look for any raised hands. Okay, let's wait another minute for people to respond.
Chris, this is Jane DeRose-Bammon.
Oh yes, I see you at the top there. Please go ahead, Jane.
Thanks. I'm interested in the new provision that you've added for climate change. What are you guys thinking of how you would implement that, or how would you go about implementing it?
Jane, this is Jennifer. I think that's a good question, first of all. And we've mulled it over and we've talked about it, and part of the executive order is to implement things to address climate change. And one of the eloquent things about the water quality standards, and I'm biased because that's what I like, is that the standards themselves and the anti-degradation policy, when they first derived the idea of developing water quality standards, they knew, or they seemed to understand, that there were pollutants and things that could affect the water quality that they couldn't foresee back in the 70s. And so the way that the standards are written up to have the anti-degradation policy in particular is in part the implementation of protections for climate change. No matter what happens with climate change, it is a pollutant. It's considered a pollutant. When we have higher temperatures, we can do modeling and show that water temperature is going to go up, but we are not permitted to downgrade water quality because of a pollutant. That we have to meet one of the 6 factors that are in the 40 CFR that outline, we're limited on when we downgrade things. Anti-degradation and the existing use actually predate what we would come to know as climate change. And I think that there's already some implementation built into the standards. I don't think that that's the end of our implementation, but I think as we stand right now, it is a good place to start.
And Jane, this is Shelley. I would add to Jennifer's the climate change addition was added to the objectives of our standards. So when we issue new water quality standards or we're revising water quality standards, the objectives of the standards is also to take that into consideration. So we wanted to be, upfront and consistent with that executive order to explicitly state that that's one of the objectives of these water quality standards.
So it might come through as another, like you said, pollutant or pollution. So through the potential listing criteria, I mean, I kind of see working through it through the impaired waters, maybe using that as a source of impaired, to cause a cause for the impaired water. And then you're saying because it's in the standard, then that'll provide the basis for any of those steps with the impairment process. So I have more, but I'll let other people go ahead and then I'll chime on next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. We have a question from Brian Dale in the chat asking if we have received any requests for an extension of the public comment period.
Hi, Brian. At this point, we have not formally received any requests for an extension.
Okay. We have a hand raised by Lois. Please go ahead.
So it's Lewis, but that's
Lewis,
okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, this is Lewis Rose. I had a question about the 126, 128, and proposed new 400 segments. I think when Jennifer discussed them, that she indicated that analysis was still ongoing. And the question I had is whether you anticipate those three stream segments and the process for those to be taken out of the normal comment process and a separate comment process for those? Or how do you envision the timing of that working if you're still in the preparation stage for what the final proposal is going to look like?
Louis, as we believe that the standard would be changed has been proposed in the draft that's available for public comment at this point. The supporting evidence that would be entered as an exhibit during the hearing has not been finalized at this point, though.
And what I was getting at primarily was if the supporting evidence were to change your mind about what the proposal looked like, do you envision any kind of public process for that occurring beyond what you've already announced?
I think at that point, I'm going to hand it over to our legal counsel, Annie, and she could potentially give some more insight as to what that would entail.
Good evening, Mr. Rose. This is Annie Maxfield, Assistant General Counsel at NMAD. And I think that what you're asking here, the answer would be relatively fact specific. So this would depend somewhat on what information you have when it is brought to our attention and where we are in the process for preparing for the hearing. We anticipate that there will be a scheduling order coming out shortly that will outline the time frame for the hearing in a little bit more detail soon. And so, I mean, this is like the lawyer answer here. It depends, right?
Yeah.
But I think it will be pretty fact specific just based on the information that you have. So if that's something that you'd like to talk to us about, by all means, you're welcome to do so.
No, and I'll certainly take advantage of that. I just wanted to know for those in the public who might also have an interest in those sections, sort of how you perceive the process to work. And so it wasn't clear when Jennifer described it, because the description was that there's things ongoing, whether it was at a point where you wanted comment on the draft proposal, what exactly you were looking for. So I wanted to get a that clarified for folks, and we'll work on the rest of it in terms of comments to the proposal.
We certainly would recommend that any comments that anyone, you, your clients, anyone else out here on this call, please do look at that draft, and your comments will be very valuable to us in how we move forward. So we do always strive to respond to, respect, and incorporate comments as appropriate. So please do give us your feedback. This is a good time to do it.
Let's see, I don't see anybody else with raised hands or the chat, so Mr. Rose-Bauman, back to you if you'd like to ask another question.
Thanks. I did see a comment in the chat box. Did you already take care of that?
Yes, we did.
Okay, thank you. So I noticed that you were adding a reference to the groundwater rule, or the surface and groundwater protection rule. So I wanted to see if I could you explain, it had to do with the toxic pollutants. Could you provide us a little bit more detail on the basis or the background for the reasoning for adding that?
This is Jennifer again. I think the reasoning for that is we wanted to be inclusive. So we have a narrative standard for toxic pollutants, and as it's currently written, it's somewhat generic. And if you're not familiar and haven't worked under 20.6.2 NMAC, which are surface and groundwater regulations, you may not be aware that there is a list of toxic pollutants. And the other addition that we added was the pollutants of emerging concern, contaminants of emerging concern. And we wanted to capture that because that is something that this narrative criteria by nature captures, but it doesn't call out specifically. So it's to add clarity for implementation predominantly.
But you truly had the authority to address any of those. I mean, you have a definition of toxic pollutants in the standards right now. So is it confusing to have the definition of toxic pollutants in the surface water quality standards and also a slightly different definition in the groundwater? Well, the surface and groundwater standards rule. So just something to consider.
That might be something that is worthy of submitting as a comment. And I think that we'd appreciate, I think we'd appreciate getting some feedback on that, in particular on that subject.
Okay, I will work on that. Thank you.
Thanks.
So, are there any other hands? Maybe.
Yes, we have a raised hand from Rachel Kahn.
Okay, I'll defer to Rachel and I will wait my turn next. Thank you.
Hello, I think I'm unmuted. Yes. I had a question about your tiered process and your how you put different items into the different tiers, and what you're thinking of is a change in a standard that can only be taken up in the triennial review. My understanding is that there could be changes to the standards petitioned at any time by both the department and the public. So I'm wondering how you made that determination of how to put the different items and topics in those different buckets. And then a somewhat related question is about how members of the public can bring up issues that weren't brought up, that didn't make it into the higher tiers of items that the department is proposing to address in this triennial review. In previous triennial reviews, the different entities can propose changes to the standards, their own proposed changes, even if it's an area of the standards that is not being addressed by the department. From what I've heard in conversations with John Verheul, that perhaps that's not the approach the department is taking this time around. And I'd like to hear what you're thinking about that.
So Rachel, this is Annie Maxfield again here, and I will answer the second part of your question there. So we do anticipate that there will be other petitions on this topic by parties other than NMED that people might want to have included in the triennial review. When we went before the WQCC in order to petition for this hearing, we did request that the WQCC limit the hearing to any other petitions that were logical outgrowths of NMED's petition. So again, it would depend somewhat on what that petition was, on the position that NMED might take as to whether it should be included or not. So I think that again is going to be rather fact specific. And, you know, if you do have something that you would like to have brought up and it is a logical outgrowth of what we had proposed, then, you know, likely there wouldn't be an issue with wrapping it up into this triennial review. And then as for the other part of your question about the tiered process and how different items are put in different tiers, I'll defer that back to Jen Fulham first, and then perhaps build on her answer from there. So Jen, you can go ahead and take that portion of the question.
Thanks, Annie. So the tiered process really came about because of we'd been working on, let me back up. We had been working on what some of the needs were for the triennial review. Whenever we ran into something that needed an amendment or needed to be looked at to see if it needed an amendment, we made a note of it. And so we had this huge list of things that we needed to look at. And given the amount that we needed to do and the resources that we have to meet those tier 1 requirements first. There are certain things we have to do during a triennial review. And you're right, we could go before the commission in between triennial reviews, but as you know, we are busy doing other designated uses, site-specific criteria, ONRW petitions, temporary standards. So we're before the commission with rule amendments regularly. So we needed to make sure we at least manage to do what the triennial review is intended to do. The second tier was, okay, we had the resources to do that. So it was really a process of elimination as to where do our resources actually run out. And things that can be brought before the commission and that are regularly brought before the commission outside of a triennial review, the timelines that the triennial imposes on some of those kinds of petitions is really lengthy. It gets wrapped up into the whole big entanglement and administrative process of a triennial, and it could actually hold back some of those petitions that we don't want to get hung up on a triennial. As you remember, last triennial, I think it started in 2014 and it did not get approved by EPA until August of 2017. And so those action items that can go before the commission outside of the triennial and be a smooth hearing process in which people can participate directly on that particular area of concern, we decided based on resources and all the other things we had to do that we weren't going to try and fit everything in the kitchen sink into this triennial because we have a mechanism to take them before the commission in a different way that's more timely and effective for people that are interested. Annie, do you want to add anything more to that, or Shelley?
This is Shelley. I'll add some examples of what is required during a triennial review. So looking at the 304A criteria that EPA issues, we have to review that. That's a requirement for the triennial review. We have to review any segments that have less than 101A2 uses, so fishable, swimmable uses that are limited aquatic life or secondary contact, we have to reevaluate those and see if they still meet those lower standards. So there are certain things that we have to review during a triennial that, you know, when we go before, like in between triennials, are more segment specific water quality standards amendments, like Jennifer was saying, ONRWs, temporary standards, UAAs, but there are more broad requirements that we need to do during a triennial.
Okay, I don't see any raised hands. Did that answer your question, Rachel?
I think so. It's somewhat. I mean, I think I still have. I'm uncertain about how, in practice, both the logical outgrowth restriction is going to be applied, and but from what I heard is that there isn't really anything that couldn't be brought up. I was confused by the language in the slide that said that can only be brought up in the triennial review. And my understanding is that anything can be brought up by petitioning the commission at any time. So
You're correct in that, Rachel.
And this is Annie Maxfield again, and I had mentioned to Lou Rose earlier as well that, you know, if you do have questions about that, if you're considering something that you think may or may not be a logical outgrowth, you're always welcome to contact us. You mentioned that you know my co-counsel for the triennial review, John Verheuel, so feel free to reach out to us with any questions.
great, thank you.
Any other questions? Jane, did you have another one?
I did. Thank you, Chris. I saw you're proposing to add a definition for effluent dominated, and your statement of reasons in the proposal says that it's for clarity in the application of water quality standards as they pertain to certain permanent discharges. Are you actually using it in the standards or proposing to add it? I didn't do a word search yet for the rest of the standards. It's just the definition at this point. Okay.
Correct. I have to be unmuted.
Thank you, Jennifer. Also, for the segments that you're proposing to change from secondary to primary recreational use, the 103, 116, 204, and 206, I'm assuming you've already prepared the UAAs for those? Are those available to review?
They would actually be an existing use analysis. UAAs are limited to those designated uses in which we're making them less stringent, and they have a lot more rigor to them. We are finishing up our development of the existing use analysis, and that would be submitted as part of our evidence for and exhibits for the proposed change.
Okay.
So
And
we
one-
have a different, we now have a new process, which has changed slightly, I think, since the last time we spoke. And that is the existing use analysis, because a use attainability analysis is specifically for those that we're making less stringent, not more stringent.
So is that what you were referring to when you went through your presentation, Jennifer? And by the way, thank you very much. It was very helpful. Slide 10, you mentioned that when a water quality standard was not stringent enough, I think you said, so you're able to make some propose some changes, and that's relating to the existing use analysis process.
Correct. Yeah, the commission needs some, the commission has to make a decision, and it's our job to bring forth the evidence that supports why we think that would be a decision. And so the UAA doesn't fit that. And so, but an existing use analysis really looks at what is the water quality? When was it, even if the water quality in 1980, that was the best water quality it had, that is the existing use. And so it doesn't matter so much as what it's meeting right now, so long as what is the highest attainable use it's had since 1975. That's the existing use. And so we now have a process to do that analysis and bring forth the information to the commission. And so that's what those are.
And by you now have, it's what you're proposing to add in section 15.
Yes. Well, actually, section 10 talks more about the existing use and that we have to change a designated use if it's less stringent than the existing use. That's in section 10. Section 15 talks about the use attainability analysis, and we do get into more detail of what's required and how a use attainability analysis is developed.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have a comment and question from Brian Dale in the chat. Consideration of 304A guidance you mentioned is required by the Triennial review process. How does that differ from adopting the groundwater rules 20.6.2 NMAC in toto, which contains dozens of pollutants? Please explain how these processes are different in regard to rigor. Thanks.
Oh, thanks for that question, Brian. Having worked both in groundwater regulations, groundwater surface water regulations, and working with the state's water quality standards, they actually derive from very different outgrowths. That's a good word for tonight. The 304A criteria are those numeric criteria that are developed based off of toxicological effects to aquatic life. What we find, and I'm a little rusty on this, is under the surface and groundwater regulations, those toxic pollutants are not derived from EPA's 304A criteria. They can be derived from drinking water standards, they can be derived from a number of sources, and they're not bound. They don't have a federal equivalent. New Mexico is one of the few states that does have groundwater standards, and so we're not bound by what EPA requires us to adopt or defend in not adopting. Whereas the 304A and what we see in our aquatic life use criteria is somewhat bound by those studies that EPA has put out and determined to be protective of aquatic life. Does that answer your question?
He says yes.
And this is Shelley. We're not referencing 20.6.2 NMAC in toto. It's the definitions of toxic pollutants. So it's listing what the state considers to be toxic pollutants in surface waters and groundwater. So it's that list of toxic pollutants in 20.6.2.7 NMAC.
Here we have another question from NP905036. Do you intend to make the slides presented available to the public?
I think that we can, and that will probably be done after our next listening session on Monday, and should be available on the 2020 Triennial Review website.
I had another question. This is Rachel Kahn with Amigos Bravos. Could you talk a little bit more about your decision-making process on the aluminum criteria to keep the current hardness-based criteria and not switch over to the EPA new recommended criteria?
Thanks for the question, Rachel. Back in, I think it was in 2018, EPA put their draft aluminum criteria out for public comment, and NMED did a pretty thorough review of the development that went into that criteria and submitted comments on the Federal Register regarding how that criteria was developed, the extension of its multilinear regression model, and how it extended beyond the supporting evidence for it. And so there was issues with it from when they first proposed it. And so that is predominantly some of the reason, and I don't have our comments in front of me right now, but our concerns with how it was derived and the applicability of it was some of the reasoning of why we are not proposing to adopt that criteria at this time.
And I would also like to add to that, implementation of EPA's revised aluminum criteria would be difficult for us at this point. We don't have the ability to measure one of the important parameters that go into the MLR, which is dissolved organic carbon. Our state lab doesn't do that yet. We have been working with them on getting that capability. That was actually part of a grant application for us to help pay for instrumentation for the Department of Health Scientific Laboratory Division to be able to do that analysis for us. So that's another issue that we have right now with implementation of the aluminum criteria. Jane, I see your hand raised again.
Thank you. Speaking of new methods, does the state lab also run the methods for microsystems and the cylindros paramopsin? Do they run those analyses?
Yes, they just started this year, earlier, about August, with microsystem analysis, and we collected our first samples this year and have them analyzed. Cylindros paramopsin, not yet.
That's what I was wondering also if you had any data, if you had started collecting data yet. So a little bit from last year or this year. Okay.
Yes, just a handful of samples right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't see any hands raised or anything else in the chat. Let's open it up to any comments or questions. Please feel free to speak up.
I would just like to take this moment to remind everybody that currently the public comment period will close on December 2nd. We do want to hear any of the comments or concerns or areas that you think NMED should consider for amendments. Please get those submitted to us so that we can start reviewing it and then preparing any changes.
And this is Shelley. I would just like to thank everyone for joining us on this WebEx tonight. I believe we had 34, possibly 36 participants at one point. So that's a really good turnout, and we appreciate your interest, and we hope to hear from you. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you for joining us. Your input is very important, and please let us know if you have any comments. Thank you very much.